My husband poured wine on my head in front of my daughter-in-law and granddaughter, and they cried from laughing. I dried my face and walked out. 10 minutes later, the front gate opened, and 3 men in suits stepped into the living room. I should have seen it coming. The evening had started like so many others over the past 43 years of marriage to Frank. I'd spent hours preparing his favorite meal, pot roast with all the trimmings, setting the dining room table with our wedding china, the same pattern I'd carefully selected as a young bride with dreams of hosting elegant dinner parties. Those dreams had died somewhere between Frank's third beer and his first criticism of how I'd overdone the gravy again. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, had arrived at 6 sharp with 15-year-old Katie in tow. Lisa never knocked anymore, just walked through our front door like she owned the place. She'd married my son Michael 12 years ago.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
And from day one, she'd made it clear that she considered me an outdated relic who didn't understand how modern families worked. Tonight was no different. "Dorothy, you didn't need to go to all this trouble," Lisa had said, though her tone suggested she thought I'd gone to too little trouble, not too much. She surveyed the dining room with the same expression she might use when examining a questionable piece of furniture at a garage sale. "We could have just ordered takeout." Katie barely looked up from her phone, offering a mumbled, "Hey, Grandma," before slumping into her chair. I tried to remember when she'd stopped running to hug me when she arrived, when her bright smile had been replaced by this studied indifference. Somewhere around 13, I think, when Lisa started making subtle comments about how some grandmothers tried too hard to be relevant in their grandchildren's lives. Frank had already started on his second bottle of beer, the condensation leaving rings on my carefully polished table. He never used coasters anymore, not since I'd stopped asking him to. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned that peace was more important than protecting furniture. Or so I'd thought. The conversation during dinner had been typical. Lisa dominated it, talking about her new promotion at the marketing firm, her plans to redecorate their kitchen, Katie's grades at the private school that Frank and I helped pay for. I contributed where I could, asking questions, showing interest, trying to be the supportive mother-in-law and grandmother I'd always attempted to be. But then Frank had started in on his usual complaints. The house was too cold. The meat was too dry. Why did I always insist on using so many dishes when simple was better? Each criticism felt like a small paper cut, insignificant on its own but painful when accumulated over decades. "Mom always tries so hard," Lisa had said with that particular laugh of hers, the one that sounded sympathetic but carried an undertone of condescension. "It's sweet, really. Very traditional." Traditional. The word had become Lisa's favorite way to dismiss everything I did or said. My cooking was traditional. My decorating was traditional. My opinions were traditional. In Lisa's vocabulary, traditional was code for outdated, irrelevant, embarrassing. Katie had giggled at something on her phone, and Lisa had leaned over to look. Whatever they were sharing had set them both off into fits of laughter. Frank had joined in without even knowing what was funny, just happy to be part of whatever was happening that didn't involve me. That's when I'd made my mistake. I'd tried to join the conversation. "What's so funny?" I'd asked, genuinely curious, wanting to be included in this moment of family connection. Frank had turned to me with that expression I'd grown to dread over the years. It wasn't anger. Exactly. It was worse. It was the look of someone who found my very existence tiresome. "Dorothy, you wouldn't understand," he'd said, his words slightly slurred from the beer. "It's a generational thing." Lisa had nodded sagely. "Some jokes just don't translate across age gaps." I'd felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but I'd pushed forward anyway. Maybe it was the wine I'd had with dinner, or maybe it was just 43 years of small humiliations finally reaching a breaking point. "Try me," I'd said quietly. "I might surprise you." That's when Frank had reached for his wine glass, the expensive Cabernet I'd bought specially for tonight, thinking it might make the evening feel more celebratory. His hand was unsteady, whether from alcohol or annoyance, I'll never know. But instead of drinking it, he'd looked at me with pure irritation. "You want to know what's funny, Dorothy?" he'd said, his voice rising. What's funny is watching you pretend you have anything relevant to contribute to this conversation. And then he'd tilted the glass. The dark red wine had cascaded over my head, soaking through my carefully styled hair, running down my face and onto the cream-colored blouse I'd chosen because Frank had once said it made me look elegant. The silence that followed had lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Lisa had burst into laughter, high and sharp. Katie had joined in, her teenage giggle mixing with her mother's cruel amusement. Even Frank had started chuckling, as if pouring wine on his wife's head was the height of comedy. I'd sat there for a moment, wine dripping from my chin onto my lap, feeling every one of my 71 years settle into my bones. The dining room where I'd served thousands of meals, where I'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and anniversaries, suddenly felt like a courtroom where I'd been found guilty of the crime of existing. Without saying a word, I'd reached for my napkin and carefully wiped the wine from my face. My movements were deliberate, controlled. I'd folded the napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate. Then I'd stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor I'd refinished myself 15 years ago. Dorothy. Oh my God. Lisa had managed between laughs. You should see your face. I'd walked to the front closet and retrieved my purse. Nobody had tried to stop me. Frank was still chuckling, shaking his head like I was an overreacting child. Lisa was wiping tears from her eyes. Katie had already returned to her phone. I'd opened the front door and stepped out into the cool evening air. The wine was starting to make my scalp itch, and I could smell the Cabernet every time I breathed. But I'd walked steadily down our front walkway, past the garden I'd planted and maintained for over 4 decades, past the mailbox with Patterson painted in letters I'd carefully stenciled myself. I hadn't looked back. Not once. 10 minutes later, as I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store down the street, trying to process what had just happened, my phone had rung. It was Frank. And for a moment, I'd thought maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe the sight of me walking out had shocked him into realizing how far he'd gone. But when I'd answered, his voice had been different, not apologetic. Confused, maybe even frightened. Dorothy, he'd said, his words coming fast. You need to come home, now. There are 3 men here. They're asking for you. They say they're lawyers, and they're talking about the house. Dorothy, what the hell is going on? I hung up on Frank without answering. My hands were trembling, not from the phone call, but from what had just happened at home. 43 years of marriage, and my husband had humiliated me in front of our family like I was some insubordinate servant. The smell of wine still clung to my hair, reminding me of every drop of disrespect that had dripped down my face. I sat in the grocery store parking lot for several more minutes, trying to process Frank's words. 3 men, lawyers, talking about the house. None of it made sense. Our house had been purchased in 1980, right after Michael was born. Frank had always handled all the paperwork. I just signed where he told me to sign. For 4 decades, I'd never questioned anything related to the property documents. My phone rang again. Frank again. This time I answered. Dorothy, for God's sake, where are you? These men are saying things that don't make any sense. His voice was different now. The tone of amusement had disappeared completely, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to panic. What kind of things? I asked, keeping my voice calm. They're saying you own the house, that it's been in your name since 1980. Dorothy, that's impossible. I bought this house. I paid the down payment. I made every single mortgage payment. I felt something strange in my stomach. It wasn't fear, it was something closer to curiosity. Did they show you any documents? Yes. They have the original deed. It says Dorothy Mae Patterson as sole owner. Dorothy, you have to come home and explain to these men that there's been some mistake. I hung up again. This time I turned off the phone completely. Dorothy Mae Patterson. That had been my maiden name, Dorothy Mae Harrison. I became Dorothy Mae Patterson when I married Frank. But why would the house be in my name? Frank had always controlled all the finances. He paid the bills, managed the bank accounts, made every decision about investments. I didn't even know how much money we had in savings. I drove home slowly, trying to understand what could be happening. When I turned onto our street, I saw a black sedan parked in our driveway. 3 men in dark suits were visible in our living room through the front window. Frank was pacing nervously back and forth, gesticulating as he spoke. I parked on the street and walked to the front door. Before I could ring the doorbell, Frank opened it abruptly. "Dorothy, finally, you need to clear up this confusion right now." He pulled me inside by the hand, completely ignoring the fact that my hair was still stained with dried wine. The 3 men stood up when I entered the room. The oldest, with gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses, approached first. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Jonathan Blackwood from the firm Blackwood, Sterling & Associates. These are my colleagues, Mr. Martinez and Mr. Chen." They nodded politely. "We apologize for disturbing you at home, but we've been trying to contact you by phone for several weeks without success." I looked at Frank, confused. "What calls?" Frank looked away. "Some salespeople called. I told them to stop bothering us." Mr. Blackwood consulted a thick folder. "Mrs. Patterson, we're not salespeople. We're the attorneys who handled the original purchase of this property in 1980. We're here because our firm was instructed to contact you if certain circumstances arose." "What circumstances?" I asked, sitting down on the sofa I'd chosen myself 20 years ago. "Attempts to modify the ownership or question your possession of this house," Frank interrupted abruptly. "Listen, gentlemen, I think there's a very big misunderstanding here. I bought this house. I have all the receipts for mortgage payments, utility bills in my name, everything." Mr. Martinez opened another folder. "Mr. Patterson, you did make the mortgage payments, yes, but as a tenant, not as an owner." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank stopped pacing. Lisa, who had been watching from the kitchen, approached slowly. Even Katie had put down her phone and was paying attention. "Tenant?" Frank's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Mr. Chen addressed me directly. "Mrs. Patterson, when this house was purchased in 1980, who provided the money for the down payment?" I tried to remember. It had been so long ago. Michael was just a baby, and we were living in a small apartment. Frank had said he'd found a perfect house, but we needed $20,000 for the down payment. At the time, it was an impossible amount for us. "I don't remember exactly where the money came from," I admitted. "It came from the inheritance you received when your parents died in the car accident in 1979, said Mr. Blackwood gently. "You inherited the house where you grew up in Columbus, Ohio, plus a considerable amount of money. Our firm sold the Ohio property and transferred all funds for the purchase of this house here." The memories began to return slowly. My parents had died in a terrible accident when Michael was only 6 months old. I was devastated, trying to cope with a baby and grief at the same time. Frank had taken care of everything. The funeral, selling my parents' house, the inheritance paperwork. I was so distraught at the time that I let him manage all the details. "Our firm had very specific instructions from your parents, Mrs. Patterson," continued Mr. Blackwood. "They wanted to ensure that any property purchased with their inheritance would be exclusively in your name. They specified that no spouse should have rights over inherited assets." Frank had turned completely pale. "This is ridiculous. We've been married for 43 years. We have joint property, not on assets inherited before marriage, Mr. Patterson. And specifically not when the original will contain specific protection clauses." Lisa finally found her voice. "Wait a minute. You're saying Dorothy owns this house? The whole house?" "Exactly, and it has been that way since 1980. I looked around the room where we'd lived our entire married life. The fireplace Frank always complained I decorated wrong. The bookshelf where he'd banished my novels to the bottom shelves. The walls he never let me paint in the colors I wanted. "Why are you here now?" I asked. Mr. Chen consulted his notes. "Because someone made an inquiry about transferring ownership of this house. When that happens, we're automatically notified and must inform the true owner." All eyes turned to Frank. His face had gone from pale to bright red. "Frank?" My voice came out firmer than I expected. "Did you try to transfer the house?" Lisa and I were just exploring options. Michael is going through financial difficulties and we thought maybe we could refinance or something to help him." Lisa stepped forward. "Dorothy, you can't be upset about this. We're family. It was just an idea to help Michael, without consulting me. Well, you don't understand these financial things, Frank said quickly. I've always kept you out of these worries to protect you. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. Mrs. Patterson, any attempt to transfer, sell, or modify ownership of this house requires your signature and only your signature. No one else has legal authority over this property. The weight of the situation was beginning to hit me. For 43 years, I had lived in this house feeling like a permanent guest. Frank decided when we could redecorate, what furniture to buy, even what color to paint the walls. He made a point of reminding me that the house needed repairs, or that the house was costing too much in heating bills. As if I were just an inconvenient resident in his domain, but the house had always been mine. Mrs. Patterson, said Mr. Blackwood softly, there's something else you should know. When your parents created the will, they included a specific clause about what should happen if you ever felt threatened or disrespected in your own property. Frank laughed nervously. Disrespected? Dorothy, you're perfectly fine here. You've never been disrespected. I looked at my husband, with wine still drying in my hair, the sour smell reminding me of how he had laughed while humiliating me in front of our family. Actually, I said calmly, I'd like to hear about that clause. Mr. Blackwood reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been waiting decades to be opened. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, and I could see my father's distinctive handwriting on the front. For Dorothy, to be opened only if she faces disrespect in her own home. My heart clenched. Even from beyond the grave, my parents had been trying to protect me. They'd known somehow that this day might come. Your father was very specific about the conditions, Mr. Blackwood said, his voice gentle but firm. If you ever felt threatened, disrespected, or unsafe in your own property, we were to present you with additional options that go beyond simple ownership. Frank was standing behind the couch now, his hands gripping the back so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Dorothy, let's not get carried away here. You're not unsafe. You're not threatened. We had a little disagreement at dinner, that's all. A little disagreement. He was calling the moment he poured wine over my head in front of our family a little disagreement. Lisa moved closer to Frank, and I noticed how they positioned themselves together, like they were facing an opponent rather than talking to family. Dorothy, you have to understand. Frank has been managing this household for over 40 years. He's made every major decision, paid every bill, handled every crisis. Just because some old paperwork says your name doesn't mean you actually know how to run a house. Katie looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. What's happening? Is Grandma getting divorced? The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Divorced. I'd never even considered it. In my generation, in my family, marriage was forever. You worked through problems. You made compromises. You endured. But enduring and living weren't the same thing, were they? Mr. Chen opened the envelope carefully. Mrs. Patterson, your parents included what we call a dignity clause in their will. If you ever invoke it, you have the legal right to immediate and exclusive possession of this property. Anyone currently residing here would have 30 days to vacate. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. It was the clock Frank's mother had given us as a wedding gift, the one he'd insisted on placing in the most prominent spot in the house, even though I'd always found it too loud. 30 days? Frank's voice cracked. You can't be serious. I've lived here for 43 years. I've put everything I have into this house. Actually, Mr. Patterson, said Mr. Martinez, consulting another document, according to our records, Mrs. Patterson has been covering not just the original down payment, but also significant renovations over the years. The kitchen remodel in 1995, paid for with funds from her parents' investment portfolio. The new roof in 2003, same source. The basement renovation where you have your workshop, also Mrs. Patterson's inheritance money. I felt like I was discovering the details of someone else's life. Frank had always presented these improvements as his projects, his investments in our future. He'd made decisions about contractors, materials, timelines. I'd simply been told what was happening in my own house. That's impossible, Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction now. I managed all the finances. I would have known where the money was coming from. Mr. Blackwood pulled out a thick folder. Your wife has had a trust fund managed by our firm since her parents' death. The trust was designed to cover household expenses, property maintenance, and improvements, without requiring her direct involvement in day-to-day management. Mr. Patterson, you've been making mortgage payments on a house that was fully paid off in 1987. The mortgage payments. For 36 years, Frank had been making unnecessary mortgage payments on a house that was already owned free and clear. Where had that money been going? The payments you've been making, continued Mr. Chen, have been going into a separate escrow account. With interest, that account now contains approximately $450,000. Lisa sat down heavily in the armchair. $450,000? Mrs. Patterson, said Mr. Blackwood, you are not only the sole owner of this property, which is currently valued at approximately $800,000, but you also have nearly $500,000 in an account that your husband has been inadvertently funding for decades. I tried to process the numbers. $800,000 plus $450,000. I was sitting here with wine-stained hair, being laughed at by my own family, and I was worth over $1 million. Frank had collapsed onto the couch. Dorothy, you have to understand. I thought I was taking care of you. I thought I was being responsible, handling all the financial stress so you wouldn't have to worry. By not telling me I owned my own house? I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? You never said anything about inheritance money or trust funds. And there it was, the truth that had been hiding underneath 43 years of marriage. Frank had controlled our finances not because he was protecting me, but because I'd let him. I'd been so overwhelmed by grief after my parents' death, so focused on being a new mother, that I'd handed over every decision to him, and he'd never bothered to actually understand what he was managing. Mrs. Patterson, said Mr. Martinez, there's one more thing you should know. The trust your parents set up also includes provisions for legal support. If you decide to invoke the dignity clause, our firm will handle all proceedings at no cost to you. Katie spoke up again, her teenage voice cutting through the adult tension. Does this mean Dad and I have to move out? All eyes turned to me. My 15-year-old granddaughter, who had laughed at my humiliation just an hour ago, was now looking at me with something that might have been concern. Or maybe just curiosity about how much power her apparently wealthy grandmother actually had. That depends on your grandmother, said Mr. Blackwood. The dignity clause can be invoked immediately, or Mrs. Patterson can choose to set conditions for continued residence. Lisa found her voice again. Conditions? What kind of conditions? I looked around the room that had been my home for over 4 decades. The walls I'd never been allowed to paint the colors I wanted. The furniture Frank had chosen because it was practical. The family photos arranged the way Lisa thought looked best. The whole house was a monument to everyone else's decisions about my life. But it was my house. It had always been my house. Frank was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not dismissal, not even panic. It was something closer to fear. Dorothy, please, let's talk about this rationally. We can work something out. Work something out. I repeated his words slowly. Frank, an hour ago, you poured wine on my head while our daughter-in-law and granddaughter laughed. You've spent 43 years making decisions about my house without consulting me. You've been taking money from me without my knowledge. What exactly did you think we should work out? I never took money from you. I made mortgage payments on a house that didn't have a mortgage, using money that should have been mine to decide how to spend. Lisa leaned forward. Dorothy, you're being unreasonable. Frank has taken care of this family for decades. He's worked hard to provide for all of us. With my money, in my house. The words felt foreign in my mouth. I'd never spoken this directly in my entire adult life. I'd spent decades softening my opinions, agreeing to keep peace, compromising to avoid conflict. But sitting here with wine still flaking off my scalp, surrounded by people who had just discovered I held all the power they'd been taking for granted, I felt something shifting inside me. Mrs. Patterson, said Mr. Blackwood gently, you don't have to make any decisions tonight. You can take time to consider your options. Actually, I said, standing up slowly, I think I've had 43 years to consider my options. I walked to the front closet and retrieved the coat I'd worn to dinner parties, church services, and family gatherings for the past 6 years. Frank had always said it looked fine when I asked his opinion. Tonight, I realized I'd never actually cared what he thought about my coat. "Where are you going?" Frank asked. "To a hotel. I need some time to think. And I can't do that here." "Dorothy, please, don't be dramatic. You can sleep in the guest room if you're upset." I turned to look at him. The guest room. In my own house, he was suggesting I sleep in the guest room. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "how quickly can the dignity clause be invoked? If you're certain, we can file the paperwork tomorrow morning. All residents would be notified officially by end of business day." Frank jumped up. "Dorothy, you can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go? This is our home." "No, Frank, this is my home. It always has been." I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard Lisa whisper urgently to Frank, "Stop her. Do something." But I was already outside, breathing the cool night air, walking away from the house that was mine, feeling for the first time in decades like I actually had somewhere to go. I spent the night at the Hampton Inn near the interstate, lying awake in a bed that wasn't mine, staring at ceiling tiles that weren't the ones I'd looked at for 43 years. The hotel room was impersonal but clean, and for the first time in decades, I could set the thermostat to exactly the temperature I wanted without anyone complaining about the heating bill. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was paying for a hotel room with my own credit card while the people living in my house, my fully paid-off house, were probably discussing how to handle the Dorothy situation. My phone had been buzzing all night. Frank called 17 times. Lisa called 6 times. Even Michael called from Seattle, which told me Lisa had already started working her network. I didn't answer any of them. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel obligated to make other people feel better about their problems. At 7 in the morning, I called Mr. Blackwood's office. His secretary put me through immediately. "Mrs. Patterson, how are you feeling this morning?" "Like I've been living someone else's life for 4 decades, I said honestly. "I want to invoke the dignity clause." "Are you certain? Once we file the paperwork, there's a mandatory 30-day notice period, but the process is irreversible." I thought about Frank's face when he'd poured the wine. The casual cruelty of it. The assumption that I would just sit there and take it because I always had before. "I'm certain. We'll have the papers filed by noon. Your family will be officially notified by end of business today." After I hung up, I sat in the hotel room's single chair and tried to figure out what came next. At 71, I was essentially starting over. The prospect should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like waking up after a very long sleep. My phone rang. Michael's number. "Mom?" His voice sounded strained. "Lisa told me what happened. Are you okay?" Michael. My son, now 43 years old, living in Seattle with his wife and 2 teenage daughters. I loved him desperately, but somewhere along the way he'd learned to see me the way his father did, as someone who needed to be managed rather than consulted. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are Emma and Sarah?" "Mom?" "Don't change the subject. Lisa says you're trying to kick Dad out of the house. She says you've lost perspective because of some old paperwork." Some old paperwork. That's how Lisa had characterized the legal documents proving I owned my own home. "Michael, did you know that I've owned the house since 1980? That it's been in my name this entire time?" A pause. "What do you mean owned it? Dad's always paid the mortgage. There hasn't been a mortgage since 1987. Your father has been making payments into an escrow account for 36 years. Silence on the other end of the line. "Michael? Mom, that doesn't sound right. Dad handles all the finances because you don't really understand that stuff." There it was again. The assumption that I was too simple, too naive, too female to understand money or legal documents or my own life. "I understand more than you think," I said quietly. "Your grandfather and grandmother made sure of that when they set up the trust fund." "Trust fund? Mom, what trust fund?" "The one that paid for your college tuition. The one that covered the down payment on your first apartment. The one that's been supplementing your father's income for your entire life." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. processing information that contradicted everything he'd believed about our family's financial situation. "Mom, I think you might be confused. Maybe you should come home and talk to Dad about this. Come home." As if I were a wayward child who needed to be brought back into line. "Michael, I am home. I'm in a hotel room that I'm paying for with my own money, making my own decisions for the first time in decades, and it feels more like home than that house has felt in years." "Mom, please don't be dramatic." Dramatic. The same word Frank had used, the same dismissive tone that suggested my feelings were inconvenient exaggerations. "I have to go, Michael. I love you, but I need you to understand that I'm not the helpless woman you and your father think I am." I hung up before he could respond. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, reading the newspaper and drinking a latte I'd ordered exactly the way I liked it. Extra hot, extra foam, cinnamon instead of nutmeg. When Lisa walked in, she looked around the small cafe until she spotted me, then approached my table with the determined stride of someone who'd come to set things straight. "Dorothy, we need to talk." "Good morning, Lisa. Would you like some coffee?" She sat down across from me without being invited. "I've been thinking about yesterday, and I realize we all got a little carried away. Family dinners can be stressful. Maybe we said things we didn't mean." I studied my daughter-in-law's face. She was 41 years old, attractive in the way that required considerable effort, and accustomed to getting what she wanted through a combination of charm and persistence. Right now, she was trying charm. "Which things did you not mean?" "Lisa, well, the laughing was inappropriate. We shouldn't have laughed when Frank spilled the wine." Spilled the wine. She was rewriting history already, turning a deliberate act of humiliation into an accident. "He didn't spill it, Lisa. He poured it on my head." She waved her hand dismissively. "Frank was drinking. You know how he gets when he's had a few beers. He didn't mean anything by it. What about you? Did you mean to laugh when your father-in-law humiliated his wife?" Lisa's carefully composed expression flickered. "Dorothy, you're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. We're family. Families tease each other. Families forgive each other. Families also respect each other. And we do respect you. But this whole house ownership thing, Dorothy, you can't seriously be thinking about kicking us out. Where would we go? Frank is 74 years old. He can't just start over somewhere else." I took a sip of my latte, enjoying the way the cinnamon complemented the coffee. Frank should have thought about that before he decided to treat me like a servant in my own home. "Your own home." Lisa leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a reasonable tone. "Dorothy, just because some old legal documents have your name on them doesn't mean you actually own anything. Frank has been the head of this household for over 40 years. He's made every important decision, handled every crisis, managed every detail of your lives together. That's what marriage is about, partnership. Partnership involves consultation, Lisa. It involves respect. It involves acknowledging that both people have value. And you do have value. You've been a wonderful wife and mother. You've kept the house beautiful, cooked amazing meals, supported Frank through everything. But running a household, managing finances, making legal decisions, Dorothy, those aren't really your strengths." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "What are my strengths, Lisa?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Well, you're nurturing. You're caring. You make people feel comfortable. Those are nice qualities for a pet." "That's not what I meant, isn't it? You want me to be nurturing and caring and comfortable, but not smart enough to understand my own financial situation. You want me to be grateful for being included in decisions about my own house, but not assertive enough to actually make those decisions myself." Lisa's mask of reasonableness was starting to slip. "Dorothy, you're 71 years old. You've never worked outside the home. You've never managed money or dealt with legal issues. Frank has protected you from all of that stress your entire marriage. Now suddenly you think you can handle everything on your own? I think I can handle making decisions about my own life." "This is ridiculous." Lisa's voice was rising now, drawing looks from other customers. "You can't just throw away 43 years of marriage because you got your feelings hurt at a family dinner." "I'm not throwing away anything, Lisa. I'm reclaiming something that was always mine." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the condescending patience she usually showed me, or even the irritation that sometimes leaked through her polite facade. It was something colder. More calculating. Fine, she said finally. If that's how you want to play this, Dorothy, then we'll play it your way. But you should know that Michael is very upset about this whole situation. And Katie, well, Katie is just confused about why her grandmother suddenly doesn't want to live with her family anymore. The emotional manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting, but I recognized the threat underneath it. If I didn't back down, if I didn't return to my proper place as the grateful, manageable family matriarch, then I would lose access to my son and granddaughter. Lisa, I said, gathering my purse and standing up. You just made a very serious mistake. What mistake? You assumed I would choose being tolerated over being respected, that I would rather be included in a family that treats me badly than risk being excluded from it entirely. I left her sitting there and walked out of the coffee shop. As I reached my car, my phone rang. Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Patterson, the papers have been filed. Your family has been officially notified. But there's something else you should know. What's that? Someone has been making inquiries about your mental competency. We think they're planning to challenge your legal right to make decisions about the property. I sat in my car, watching other people go about their normal lives, and felt something hard and determined settle in my chest. Then I guess we'd better be ready for them. The mental competency evaluation was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10. Dr. Richard Steinberg's office was in a medical building downtown, all beige walls and uncomfortable chairs designed to make people feel like patients rather than clients. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the navy blue suit I'd bought for my nephew's wedding 2 years ago, but had never worn because Frank said it made me look like I was trying too hard. Mr. Blackwood met me in the lobby. Mrs. Patterson, are you ready for this? As ready as I can be for having my own family try to prove I'm incompetent. The petition had been filed by Frank, with Lisa's full support and Michael's reluctant signature. They were claiming that my sudden erratic behavior and irrational decisions about property indicated possible dementia or diminished capacity. They wanted a court-appointed guardian to manage my affairs. What they didn't know was that Dr. Steinberg had been my choice, not theirs. When Mr. Blackwood explained that I had the right to select the evaluating physician, I'd done something I'd never done before in my life. I'd researched my options thoroughly and made my own decision. Dr. Steinberg was 78 years old, a retired psychiatrist who specialized in geriatric assessments. More importantly, he was known for his skepticism about family members who suddenly discovered concerns about elderly relatives' mental capacity when financial issues arose. Mrs. Patterson, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a gray beard, appeared in the waiting room doorway. I'm Dr. Steinberg. Shall we begin? His office was warm and comfortable, with bookshelves full of psychology texts and family photos that suggested a man who understood the difference between professional distance and human connection. Before we start, he said, settling into a chair across from me rather than behind his desk, I want you to know that I've reviewed the petition filed by your family. I've also reviewed the legal documents provided by your attorney. This is quite an unusual situation. Unusual how? In my 45 years of practice, I've rarely seen a case where someone's mental competency is questioned immediately after they discover they own significant assets their family wasn't aware of. He smiled slightly. It tends to raise questions about timing. The evaluation lasted 3 hours. Dr. Steinberg tested my memory, my reasoning ability, my understanding of current events. He asked me to explain complex financial concepts, to solve mathematical problems, to demonstrate my understanding of legal documents. He had me recall details from my childhood, my marriage, my son's life. By the end, I felt more mentally sharp than I had in years. Answering his questions required me to think clearly, to articulate my thoughts precisely, to defend my reasoning. It was the first time in decades that someone had actually wanted to understand how my mind worked, rather than simply assuming it didn't work very well. Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Steinberg said as we finished, I'll have my report completed by tomorrow morning. But I can tell you now that you show no signs whatsoever of cognitive impairment, dementia, or diminished capacity. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your understanding of your legal and financial situation is quite sophisticated. Thank you. There is one thing I want to mention, though. You've described a pattern of behavior from your family that concerns me. The systematic exclusion from financial decisions, the dismissal of your opinions, the assumption that you couldn't understand complicated matters. Those aren't signs of protective care. They're signs of what we call financial and emotional abuse. The words hit me like a physical blow. Abuse. I'd never thought of it that way. Frank wasn't violent. He'd never hit me or threatened me. But the constant undermining, the casual dismissal of my intelligence, the way he'd made me feel grateful for basic respect, was that abuse? I realize it's difficult to hear, Dr. Steinberg continued gently, but what you've described is a classic pattern of isolating someone from their own resources and decision-making power. The fact that your family is now questioning your mental capacity specifically because you've asserted your legal rights, well, that speaks volumes about their motivations. I left his office feeling simultaneously vindicated and devastated. Vindicated because a medical professional had confirmed what I'd started to suspect. I wasn't crazy, irrational, or incompetent. Devastated because I was finally seeing 43 years of marriage clearly, and it wasn't the loving partnership I'd convinced myself it was. Mr. Blackwood was waiting in his car outside the medical building. How did it go? Dr. Steinberg says I'm completely competent. He'll have the written report tomorrow. Excellent. That should put an end to their legal challenge. He paused. Mrs. Patterson, there's something else. Your family has requested a meeting. They want to discuss a reasonable compromise before the 30-day notice period expires. I checked my watch. It was 2 p.m. In 18 days, Frank, Lisa, and Katie would have to vacate my house. The house I'd never been allowed to paint the colors I wanted. The house where I'd spent decades feeling like a guest. What kind of compromise? They're proposing that you return home and they'll treat you with appropriate respect going forward. In exchange, you would give them permanent residency rights and add Frank's name to the deed. I almost laughed. They wanted me to give up the only leverage I'd ever had in exchange for a promise to treat me better. A promise from people who had just tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. Where do they want to meet? Your house, this evening at 7. My house. The irony was perfect. They wanted to negotiate for the right to stay in my house by meeting in my house. Tell them I'll be there. At 6:30, I drove to the house I'd called home for 43 years. I parked in the driveway, my driveway, and sat for a moment, looking at the structure that represented everything I'd gained and lost in my adult life. The garden beds I'd planted and maintained for decades were showing signs of neglect. Frank had never cared about flowers, and apparently neither did Lisa. The front porch where I'd spent countless evenings reading was cluttered with Katie's bicycle and some sports equipment that Frank had probably bought without asking me. I used my key to open the front door. It was still my house after all. They were waiting in the living room. Frank sat in his usual chair, the one positioned to give him the best view of the television. Lisa was on the sofa, perfectly dressed as always. Katie was cross-legged on the floor, surprisingly present for a conversation that would determine her living situation. Dorothy, Frank stood up as I entered. Thank you for coming home. Home. He said it like I'd been away on vacation rather than being driven out by his behavior. I'm not home, Frank. I'm visiting. Lisa gestured to the chair across from her. Please, sit down. We want to work this out like adults. I remained standing. What exactly do you want to work out? Frank cleared his throat. Dorothy, we've all done some thinking since this situation started. Maybe we haven't always been as considerate as we should have been. Considerate. We want you to come home. We want to be a family again, but we need some security, some guarantees that this won't happen again. What kind of guarantees? Lisa leaned forward. We're proposing that you add Frank's name to the deed. That way, we're all protected. You can't be taken advantage of by outsiders, and Frank can't be thrown out of his home on a whim. His home. Even now, even knowing that I owned everything, she was calling it his home. And in return, Frank said, we promise to include you more in family decisions. We'll be more respectful of your opinions. Katie spoke up for the first time. And I promise not to laugh at you anymore, Grandma. That was mean. The apology from my 15-year-old granddaughter was probably the most genuine thing I'd heard from any of them. But it also revealed how little they understood about what had happened. They thought this was about hurt feelings and family dynamics. They had no idea it was about 43 years of systematic diminishment. "What if I say no?" I asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Dorothy," Lisa's voice took on an edge, "you need to think about this carefully. If you force us out, you'll be completely alone. No family, no support system. What happens when you really do need help? What happens when you actually do get sick or confused?" The threat was subtle, but clear. Play along, or be abandoned entirely. Frank tried a different approach. "Dorothy, I know I made mistakes, but we've been married for 43 years. Doesn't that count for something? Don't I deserve a chance to make things right? You've had 43 years to make things right, Frank. I didn't know you felt this way. You never said anything. I said plenty. You just never listened." Lisa stood up, her patience finally exhausted. "Fine, Dorothy. If this is how you want it, then this is how it'll be. But don't come crying to us when you realize what you've thrown away." I looked at each of them in turn. Frank, with his expression of wounded bewilderment, still unable to understand that control wasn't the same as care. Lisa, barely containing her anger at losing the comfortable arrangement she'd taken for granted. Katie, confused and caught in the middle of an adult conflict she couldn't fully comprehend. "I'm not throwing anything away," I said quietly. "I'm reclaiming something that was always mine." I turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "You have 16 days left. I suggest you use them wisely." 16 days later, I stood in my driveway at 8 in the morning, watching the moving truck pull away from my house. Frank had left 3 hours earlier, driving his pickup truck loaded with the workshop tools he'd accumulated over 4 decades. He hadn't said goodbye. Lisa had departed the day before with 2 SUVs full of belongings, taking Katie with her to stay at her sister's house until they found a rental. The goodbye scene had been dramatic, with Katie crying and Lisa making pointed comments about how I was destroying our family for the benefit of the neighbors who had gathered to watch. I'd remained on the front porch throughout the exodus, not gloating, not arguing, just present. It was my house, and I wanted to witness every moment of reclaiming it. Mr. Blackwood had handled all the legal details with military precision. The eviction notice had been served exactly as required. When Frank threatened to contest it, Dr. Steinberg's competency report had shut down that avenue immediately. When Lisa tried to claim squatters' rights, the original deed and trust documents had ended that fantasy as well. Now, for the first time in 43 years, I was completely alone in my own home. The silence was extraordinary. No television blaring in the background because Frank needed constant noise. No Lisa's voice carrying from the kitchen as she made phone calls to her friends, discussing their lives in the dismissive tone she'd always used when talking about me. No Katie's music seeping through bedroom walls, or the constant electronic beeping of devices I was never allowed to understand. Just silence and space, and the absolute freedom to do whatever I wanted with both. I walked through each room slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The living room where Frank's chair had dominated the layout for decades now looked oddly lopsided, like a mouth missing a tooth. The kitchen where Lisa had gradually taken over, moving my favorite dishes to inconvenient cabinets and replacing my simple cookware with complicated gadgets, felt foreign and cluttered, but it was mine. Every square inch of it was mine. The first thing I did was change the locks. Mr. Blackwood had recommended it, and I'd hired a locksmith to come at 9. By 10 o'clock, I was the only person with keys to my own house, a situation that should have been normal but felt revolutionary. The second thing I did was go to the paint store. "What kind of room are we painting?" asked the young woman behind the counter. "All of them," I said. "I want to paint all of them." I chose colors I'd been dreaming about for decades. Soft yellow for the kitchen, the color of morning sunshine, deep blue for the living room, like the ocean on a calm day, warm green for the master bedroom, like the garden I'd always wanted to expand, rich purple for the guest room, no, for my office. I was going to have an office. The painting took 3 weeks. I hired professionals for the tall walls and did the detail work myself, something I hadn't done since I was a young woman living in my first apartment. My back ached and my hands got stiff, but every brushstroke felt like an act of reclamation. Frank called twice during the renovation. The first time to ask if he could come get some tools he'd forgotten in the garage. I told him to make a list and I'd leave them on the front porch. The second time to inform me that he'd found an apartment and was doing fine, in case I was wondering. I hadn't been wondering, but I'd said I was glad he'd found somewhere suitable. Lisa called more frequently, usually to deliver updates about Katie that were really attempts to make me feel guilty. Katie was having trouble adjusting to her new school. Katie missed her old room. Katie didn't understand why her grandmother had chosen a house over her family. "Dorothy," Lisa said during her latest call, "Katie's been asking if she can visit you. She says she wants to see what you've done to the house." It was the first time in a month that anyone had expressed genuine curiosity about my choices, rather than criticism of them. "She's welcome anytime," I said. "But Lisa, I need you to understand something. If Katie visits, she visits me, not you. If you want to rebuild a relationship with me, you'll need to do that separately. I don't understand why you're being so harsh. We're still family." "No, Lisa, you and I were never family. I was Frank's wife, and you were Michael's wife, and that created an obligation for us to tolerate each other. But family requires mutual respect, and we never had that." The conversation had ended with Lisa hanging up on me, but 3 days later, Katie had called herself. "Grandma Dorothy, Mom said I could visit this weekend if you want me to." "I would love that, sweetheart." Katie arrived on Saturday afternoon, driven by Michael, who had flown in from Seattle specifically to see the house that had caused such upheaval in our family. I'd been nervous about seeing my son, unsure how our relationship would survive the changes I'd made. He stood in my front doorway looking older than his 43 years, his face drawn with the stress of trying to navigate between his wife's demands and his mother's transformation. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Michael." Katie pushed past both of us. "Grandma, I want to see everything. Mom said you painted it all different colors." She ran through the house like a tourist, exclaiming over each room's transformation. When she reached what had been the guest room and saw my new office, complete with a desk, computer, and bookshelves full of the novels Frank had always dismissed as silly romance trash, she stopped and stared. "Grandma, you have an office?" "I do. I'm taking some online classes and I needed a place to study." "What kind of classes?" "Real estate law, financial planning, art history." I'd enrolled in 3 different programs through the community college's distance learning division. At 71, I was finally getting the education I'd put on hold when I got married at 28. "I'm thinking about getting my real estate license." Michael appeared in the doorway behind Katie. "Mom, are you serious about that?" "Very serious. I own a valuable property, and I want to understand how to manage it properly. I also want to help other women who might be in situations similar to mine." "What kind of situations?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, and apparently failed to help understand the difference between protection and control. "Women who don't know they have options, Michael. Women who've been told for so long that they can't handle complicated things that they've started to believe it themselves." Katie flopped down in my office chair and spun around. "This is so cool, Grandma. You're like learning stuff and making your house exactly how you want it." "Exactly." Michael walked around the office, studying the books on my shelves, the papers spread across my desk, the certificate from my completed financial planning course hanging on the wall. "Mom, I owe you an apology. I waited. When this all started, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown. I thought Dad was right, that you were being irrational and needed us to protect you from making bad decisions." He picked up one of my textbooks, flipping through it absently. "But looking at all this, seeing what you've accomplished in just a few months, I think maybe we were the ones who didn't understand the situation. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of everything that had happened, but it was more self-awareness than I'd expected from him." "Thank you for saying that. Can I ask you something? Are you happy? Really happy? Not just making the best of things?" I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? I missed having a family, even a dysfunctional one. I missed the routine of cooking for others, the sense of being needed, even if it was being needed to be invisible. Sometimes the silence in the house felt oppressive rather than peaceful. But I also woke up every morning without dreading the day ahead. I made decisions about my time, my space, my money, without having to justify them to anyone else. I discovered that I was actually quite good at managing finances and understanding legal documents when someone wasn't constantly telling me I couldn't handle such things. I'm happier than I've been in decades, I said honestly. I'm lonelier sometimes, but I'm happier. Katie jumped up from the chair. Grandma, can I come visit you again? Like regularly? Mom said she might let me spend weekends here sometimes if you want. I looked at my granddaughter. Really looked at her, 15 years old, caught between childhood and adulthood, trying to understand why the adults in her life had suddenly rearranged themselves in confusing ways. I would love that. Katie. But I need you to understand something important. What? When you're here, you treat me with respect. That means no laughing when adults are being cruel to each other. It means listening when I talk instead of assuming I don't understand things. It means recognizing that I'm not just someone's grandmother. I'm a person with my own thoughts and feelings and opinions. She nodded solemnly. I can do that. Then yes, you're welcome here any time. After Michael and Katie left that evening, I sat on my front porch, the same porch where I'd spent countless evenings reading while Frank watched television, and watched the sunset paint my garden in shades of gold and amber. Tomorrow, I was meeting with a contractor about expanding the flower beds and maybe adding a small greenhouse. Next week, I had an appointment with a travel agent to discuss a trip to Italy I'd been dreaming about for 30 years. My phone rang. Frank's number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. Dorothy. His voice sounded tired, older somehow. Hello, Frank. I was wondering. Michael said you're doing well. I am. I wanted you to know that I found a nice place, a senior community with activities and meals included. It's actually pretty comfortable. I'm glad you're settling in. A long pause. Dorothy, I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was taking care of you. I looked out at my garden, at the roses I'd planted and pruned and fertilized for decades, without ever being asked if I wanted roses or if I might prefer something else. I know you thought that, Frank. Do you think, would it be possible for us to be friends? Maybe not right away, but someday? Friends. The word hung in the evening air like a question mark. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know if I can forgive everything that happened. But I don't hate you, Frank. I just needed to stop living your life and start living mine. I understand. After we hung up, I sat on my porch until the stars came out. The house behind me was quiet, and mine. The future ahead of me was uncertain, but also mine. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, in my own life, and started planning what to do with all three.